What happens when a family heirloom disappears without warning, and the one person you trusted betrays you? The house held secrets, and a twist no one expected. Ruth Evans awoke to the sound of birdsong drifting through the kitchen window. Spring had come late this year, but the forsythia bush outside glowed yellow, sunlight dappled on her linoleum floor. She poured herself coffee, savoring the quiet and the certainty that her home, this old, creaky house on Sycamore Lane, was full of history and memory. This house had been Ruth's anchor for over 40 years. Every room carried echoes, the faint scent of lilacs in the parlor, the dent in the banister from where her late husband, Walter, had tripped and laughed. Cabinets brimmed with china passed down from her grandmother. Faded quilts were stacked in the cedar chest her mother had sewn by hand. Ruth's daughter-in-law, Karen, and her son, Tom, had moved in a year ago to help, though Ruth often wondered if the arrangement was for her benefit or theirs. Karen's voice echoed from upstairs, cheerful and brisk. "Tom, have you seen my keys?" The pair tumbled down the steps, Tom carrying files from his home office, Karen in workout clothes and a cloud of perfume. Ruth smiled, offering fresh muffins. Karen kissed her cheek lightly, barely slowing. "Can't talk, Ruth. Estate sale today, remember? We're heading out early." Ruth set about her morning, tending the flower beds and chatting with Mrs. Gillian next door. After lunch, she tidied the living room, dusting the shelves that held her prized family heirlooms, delicate teacups, a silver candelabra, hand-painted plates. The house was quiet, Karen and Tom gone for hours. Ruth tried to relax with her knitting but felt a peculiar sense of unease. It wasn't until she checked the cabinet beneath the stairs that her heart began to race. The jewelry box that belonged to her grandmother was missing. She searched the closet. Nothing. She moved to the guest room, pulling out drawers and peeking under the bed. Gone, too, was the ornate clock Walter's parents had given them for their wedding. Ruth's hands shook as she checked the hallway shelf. The miniature ivory horse, a cherished piece from her own childhood, was missing as well. Panic simmered, then boiled over. Ruth dialed Tom. No answer. She tried Karen, but the call went straight to voicemail. She left a message, voice quivering, "Did you move some things? Please call me." She paced the hallway, staring at the empty spots where her treasures once sat, her mind reeling through possibilities. Maybe they'd taken the items for cleaning, maybe for appraisal, but why without a word? Hours later, Tom returned alone, coat slung over his arm. He looked tired, distracted, his phone buzzing in his pocket. Ruth met him in the foyer, demanding an explanation. Tom hesitated, eyes darting to the floor. "Karen said she'd talk to you, Mom. She found a dealer who offered a good price for some of the old stuff. You never use any of it. She thought it might help with the bills." Ruth's words caught in her throat, a hot flush spreading across her cheeks. "Those were not just old stuff, Tom. They were my family's." Tom tried to reassure her, muttering about downsizing and letting go, but Ruth barely heard him. When Karen finally came home, cheeks flushed, eyes bright, she chirped, "You have too many things, Ruth. We need space. Besides, you always say you want to keep the house running." Her words were brisk, final. Ruth barely slept that night, wandering room to room, feeling the emptiness on every shelf. She stared at the old family portrait above the mantel, trying to draw comfort from familiar faces. She remembered each item in detail: her grandmother's brooch, Walter's clock, the teacup set with the tiny chip her mother always hid at the back. The next morning, the silence in the house was different, thicker, charged. Ruth found a receipt on the kitchen counter, a list of items, a total she barely recognized as fair. There was no apology, no explanation. Only a small sticky note in Karen's handwriting: "Don't worry, this will help with expenses." Ruth called her friend Carol and told her everything over tea. Carol shook her head, outraged. "That was your history, Ruth. Not theirs to give away." Ruth nodded, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. As the afternoon sun faded, Ruth sat in her favorite chair, hands folded in her lap, her mind moving restlessly through memories and losses. This house was all she had left. She stared out the window, heart thudding, as the first feelings of betrayal settled deep into her bones, cold and clear. The morning after her discovery, Ruth moved through her house as if it were a stranger's. Every room seemed subtly wrong. The hallway echoed more sharply. The living room's mantel felt naked without Walter's old clock. She made coffee, but it tasted thin and bitter. Even the sunlight through the curtains looked faded. Ruth stared at the receipt Karen had left, running her fingers over each item, each one a memory, each one gone. Karen and Tom ate breakfast in the kitchen, talking about the gym and Tom's upcoming Zoom meetings. Ruth watched them from the doorway, her presence barely acknowledged. "Morning, Ruth," Karen chirped, not meeting her eye. Tom mumbled something, then left his plate half-eaten. No one mentioned the missing heirlooms. Ruth forced herself to eat a slice of toast, the silence between them more bitter than burnt bread. After they left, Ruth called the antique shop named on the receipt. A woman answered, confirming that several items were sold yesterday. "Lovely pieces, ma'am. Very valuable. Sold quickly." Ruth's heart clenched. Did the seller mention they belonged to someone else? The woman paused. "Sorry, ma'am, I wouldn't know." Ruth hung up, anger and helplessness warring in her chest. Unable to stay still, Ruth walked to Carol's house 2 streets over. Carol poured strong tea, listening as Ruth recounted every detail, what was missing, what Karen had said, how small she felt in her own home. "You have rights, Ruth," Carol insisted. "This is your house, your things. They had no business touching them." Ruth nodded, voice raw. But what rights did she have left when her family saw her history as clutter? Back at home, Ruth wandered from room to room, cataloging the losses, the embroidered tablecloth from her wedding chest, the tiny silver bell that always rang in her grandchildren's hands, the set of blue willow plates only ever used at Christmas. She tried to distract herself by weeding the garden, but her mind was a restless tide. Every time she saw Karen's car in the driveway, her chest tightened with anger. Tom returned home late, and Ruth confronted him again. "Why didn't you ask me, Tom? Why did you let Karen do this?" Tom sighed, rubbing his temples. "We needed the money, Mom. You don't even use most of that stuff. It was just collecting dust." Ruth snapped, her voice sharper than she'd ever meant it to be. "It wasn't dust. It was my life." Tom walked away, muttering that she was being dramatic. The following days fell into uneasy routine. Ruth moved quietly, wary of Karen's bright moods and Tom's sudden silences. The house felt colder, emptier. Ruth found herself missing the smallest things, a chipped sugar bowl, the velvet lining of the jewelry box, the sound of Walter's clock striking the hour. Carol checked in daily, sometimes bringing homemade soup, other times just company. They talked about old times, about the husbands they missed and the way things changed when children grew up. "People forget who built the foundation they're standing on," Carol said, squeezing Ruth's hand. Sunday brought a phone call from Ruth's niece in California. "Aunt Ruth, how are you?" Ruth hesitated, choosing her words carefully, masking the sadness. "I'm fine, dear. Just a little house trouble." She didn't share details, unwilling to make her pain part of someone else's day. That night, Ruth sat in the dim light of her bedroom, looking at the house's deed tucked inside her nightstand. Her name was still there, bold and certain, proof of what was truly hers. She brushed her fingers over the embossed seal, a seed of resolve stirring deep within her. This house, her memories, her story wasn't finished yet. Monday dawned gray and cool, the sky hanging heavy over Sycamore Lane. Ruth rose early, mind buzzing with unease. She moved through her morning chores, feeding the sparrows in the garden, folding laundry, wiping crumbs from the kitchen table. Each action meant to anchor her, to claim some small piece of the ordinary. But everywhere she looked, the absences loomed, blank spaces on the shelves, empty hooks, a hush where the clock used to chime. By 9, Karen was already on her phone, pacing the living room. "Yes, the open house is scheduled for Saturday," Ruth overheard, confusion prickling. Karen caught her look. "Oh, it's just for my friend. She's looking at houses, and I promised to show her the layout here." "Don't worry, Ruth." Her tone was sweet but dismissive, her eyes sharp with warning. Tom left for work, barely glancing Ruth's way. The coldness between them had settled like frost. Ruth found herself alone, the echo of Karen's voice ringing in her ears. She retreated to her sewing room, needing comfort. She opened the last drawer, a collection of scraps and half-finished quilts, untouched by Karen's purge. Ruth pulled out a patchwork square her mother had pieced decades ago, running her fingers over the tiny, perfect stitches. The fabric was soft, worn thin by generations, its story known only to Ruth. After lunch, Ruth visited the library to return a stack of cookbooks. She lingered by the bulletin board, reading notices for garden clubs and estate planning workshops. Mrs. Gillian, her neighbor, waved her over. "How are you, Ruth? I haven't seen you out as much." Ruth hesitated, then shrugged. "Just tired, I suppose." Mrs. Gillian patted her arm. "If you need anything, I'm right next door." Walking home, Ruth passed the antique store. Through the window she saw, displayed prominently, her grandmother's porcelain brooch on a velvet stand. The price tag was shockingly high. Ruth's throat tightened, tears threatening. She hurried on, heart pounding. At home, she sat on the porch, watching the world go by, kids on bicycles, the mailman waving, Carol gardening across the street. She found herself longing for the old days, when her home was her own. That evening, Karen announced she'd invited friends for dinner on Thursday, just a few people. Ruth's chest constricted at the idea of strangers filling rooms that felt so empty without her things. She wanted to protest, to reclaim some territory, but her words caught. "Just let me know if you need help," she murmured, already feeling invisible. After supper, Ruth called Carol and told her about the brooch. Carol's outrage burned hot. "You should have called the police. Or a lawyer. Or me." Ruth shook her head, exhausted. "It's too late. They're all gone now." Carol was silent for a moment, then said, "You still have your house, Ruth. That's something." That night, Ruth lay awake, listening to the house creak in the darkness, the shadows shifting across the ceiling. She thought of every celebration and sorrow these walls had witnessed, every piece that had vanished, every part that remained. She knew the house was still hers on paper, but she felt it slipping away in spirit, room by room, memory by memory. Before sleep, Ruth resolved to visit her attorney in the coming days. Not out of spite, she told herself, but to remember what still belonged to her, and what, if anything, she could truly reclaim. Tuesday morning dawned with a sharp wind rattling the windows. Ruth woke early, steeling herself for the day ahead. She dressed in her best slacks and a pressed blouse, the kind she once wore to church socials and town meetings, and made a careful list before heading out: attorney, bank, notary. She left a note for Tom and Karen, out for appointments. "We'll be back late afternoon." The law office was in a brick building above the pharmacy downtown. Ruth's attorney, Mr. Dawson, was a patient man in his 70s who remembered Walter and always offered her a cup of tea. She sat across from him, hands wrapped tight around her purse. "I need to understand my options, Mr. Dawson," she said, voice steady. "My name is still on the deed, and my daughter-in-law sold family possessions behind my back. I feel like a guest in my own house." Mr. Dawson listened, jotting notes, then reviewed the paperwork Ruth provided. He explained her legal standing. As sole owner, she controlled the house entirely. She could rent, sell, or change the locks if she wished. Karen and Tom had no claim unless she made it so. "As for your things," he said, "I can draft a formal letter requesting return or restitution. But the antiques, once gone, may not come back." Ruth nodded, her disappointment familiar by now. He advised her to consider her next steps carefully. "This house is your security, Ruth. Don't let guilt or pressure cloud your choices." She left with a folder of documents and a quiet resolve warming her chest. Afterwards, Ruth stopped at the bank to check her accounts. She spoke with the manager, confirming her finances and updating her will's contact details. The manager greeted her kindly, complimenting her organization. "You'd be surprised how many folks your age get taken advantage of," he said. Ruth managed a sad smile, the truth cutting close. She stopped for coffee at the bakery, savoring a blueberry scone and a few moments of gentle music. The shop owner, Mrs. Park, came by with extra napkins and a free lemon tart for being a loyal neighbor. Ruth thanked her, surprised at how much a small kindness could soften a long, hard morning. Returning home, she found Karen on the phone, talking loudly about a home staging company. Ruth set her documents on the kitchen counter. Tom glanced at the folder, brow furrowing. "You were gone a while, Mom. Everything okay?" Ruth met his gaze. "I had some legal matters to settle. Nothing to worry about." She saw Karen stiffen, her voice faltering. "Did you need a ride somewhere?" Tom asked, an edge in his tone. Ruth shook her head, feeling a new sense of strength blooming in her chest. I managed fine on my own." That afternoon, Ruth took a long walk through the neighborhood, letting the wind clear her mind. She passed by Mrs. Gillian's garden, stopped to admire the early crocuses, and waved at Carol, who was sweeping her porch. They walked together, discussing old friends and town gossip. Ruth didn't mention her morning at the attorney's office, but Carol sensed the change. "You look taller today," she teased. Ruth grinned, the first real smile in days. By the time she returned home, the sun had dipped low, casting the house in golden light. Ruth brewed tea, sat in her favorite chair, and paged through her documents. She thought of every corner of the house, every story woven into its walls. She realized she was not just a witness to her own life, she still had power, and her story was hers to write. The evening meal was quiet, the tension in the house sharper than ever. Karen scrolled through real estate listings on her tablet. Tom ate silently, eyes darting between his wife and his mother. Ruth finished her soup, her resolve as steady as the old brick foundation beneath her feet. Wednesday arrived, unusually warm for spring. Ruth stood at her bedroom window, watching the sun rise over the familiar rooftops. She dressed with purpose, her steps light but certain as she moved through the house. Downstairs, Tom was already at his laptop, muttering about spreadsheets and deadlines, while Karen hurried past, purse in hand. "Don't forget, Ruth, I have an appointment with the stager this afternoon," Karen called over her shoulder, her tone brisk. Ruth simply nodded, offering nothing in return. When they were gone, Ruth opened the folder Mr. Dawson had given her and began to make calls. She confirmed an appointment with a local realtor, one Carol had recommended, a woman known for her discretion and compassion with long-time residents. Ruth explained her situation in measured terms, never betraying the tremor beneath her words. The realtor, Ms. Holland, listened carefully, promised confidentiality, and scheduled a walkthrough for the next morning. Afterward, Ruth changed the locks on the back door, a quiet act that sent a ripple of satisfaction through her. She left Tom and Karen's keys where they'd find them, but felt a new barrier go up. She then sat down at the kitchen table and drafted a letter, following Mr. Dawson's instructions, demanding a list of all items removed from the house and proof of their sale. She addressed it to both Karen and Tom, placing it prominently on the mantel. Late morning, Carol arrived with a basket of groceries and her usual cheer. They shared coffee in the sunroom, the air fragrant with new blossoms from Carol's garden. Ruth confided the details of her legal meeting. Carol listened, nodding with approval. "You're taking your life back," she said, eyes shining. "Don't let anyone make you feel small in your own home." Ruth squeezed her friend's hand, grateful for the support. That afternoon, Karen returned, the stager in tow. The woman made notes, snapped photos, and suggested moving furniture, removing family pictures, freshening up the space. Ruth stood quietly, her face calm as she watched strangers judge her home. She offered no protest, only a polite smile and a steady gaze that made the stager fidget. After they left, Ruth restored the house to her liking. She put her family photos back on the mantel, dusted the old rocking chair, and opened the windows to let the spring air in. She watered the violets in the dining room, remembering her mother's gentle voice, "You keep what matters close, Ruthie." Evening brought an unexpected visitor, Ms. Holland, stopping by early to introduce herself. They sat together at the kitchen table, sharing stories about the neighborhood, about old houses and the stubbornness of roots. Ms. Holland asked careful questions, making Ruth feel seen and heard. "You're in control," she assured. "You decide what happens here." Dinner that night was tense. Tom's eyes lingered on the letter atop the mantel. Karen's on the photos. Ruth had returned to their places. Conversation was brief and brittle. Ruth finished her meal, cleared her plate, and retired early, a quiet dignity wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl. Upstairs, Ruth opened her journal and wrote, "There is power in knowing when enough is enough. This house is my last word. I will not be erased." She fell asleep with the windows open, the scent of violets drifting through the room, the sound of her own heart steady and sure. The next morning, Ruth woke before dawn. She moved quietly, savoring the rare solitude as she brewed coffee and watched light seep into the yard. Tom and Karen left early, Tom muttering about an office emergency, Karen saying she had errands. Ruth closed the door behind them, breathing easier with the house to herself. At precisely 10, Ms. Holland rang the bell. She arrived alone, her notebook in hand, her smile warm and professional. "Thank you for trusting me, Mrs. Evans," she said as Ruth welcomed her in. They began the walk-through, room by room. Ruth pointed out details: the original woodwork in the foyer, the sun-catching dust motes in the old parlor, the nicks on the banister where Walter had once lost his footing but never his laugh. In the kitchen, Miss Holland asked about Ruth's wishes for the sale: privacy, timeline, what she hoped the next owners would appreciate. Ruth was careful, her voice low but firm. "I want this house to matter to someone. I want it to be a home, not just another transaction." Ms. Holland nodded, making notes. "We'll do this your way. No for sale signs, no open houses unless you approve. Discretion is key." As they moved upstairs, Ruth paused outside the guest room. She lingered by the closet, staring at the empty space where her mother's quilts had been stored. Ms. Holland sensed her sadness and offered reassurance. "Sometimes letting go makes room for something new, even if it's just peace of mind." Ruth smiled, a little, for the first time in days. Once the walk-through was finished, they sat in the kitchen and reviewed paperwork. Ms. Holland explained next steps: a private listing to vetted buyers, showings only with Ruth's permission, every detail on Ruth's terms. Ruth felt both apprehension and relief, like the house itself was breathing differently. After Ms. Holland left, Ruth called Carol and invited her over for lunch. They ate chicken salad and fresh bread at the sunlit table, the windows open to the gentle wind. Carol listened intently as Ruth described the morning. "You've done something brave, Ruth. Not just for you, but for your memories." Ruth blinked back tears, letting her friend's words soak in. The rest of the day, Ruth tackled small tasks she'd been neglecting. She wrote notes to friends, polished the old brass doorknobs, made a pot of soup. At dusk, she took a walk around the block, greeting neighbors and pausing at the corner where children played hopscotch. She saw Mrs. Gillian tending her roses, and they exchanged news about the town council and the best fertilizer for hydrangeas. That night, Tom returned home, tense and distracted. Karen barely acknowledged Ruth as she rushed upstairs. At dinner, Tom finally asked about the letter on the mantel. "What's this about, Mom?" Ruth answered simply, "It's about respect. About what was lost, and what still matters." Tom fell silent, and Ruth let the quiet linger. She finished her soup, cleared her plate, and left the kitchen, her resolve unspoken but unmistakable. In her bedroom, Ruth changed into her nightgown and sat at her window, watching the lights flicker on across the neighborhood. She felt sadness for all she'd lost, but for the first time, she felt something else, too: control. In her journal, she wrote, "A home is more than what fills its rooms. Sometimes it's what you refuse to let go." She slept soundly, the house holding her story, her boundaries, and, finally, her will. The following days unfolded in quiet but relentless tension. Ruth received a discreet call from Ms. Holland. There was interest in the house, 2 serious inquiries from families looking for a home, not an investment. Ruth's chest tightened with the weight of change, but she felt ready. She set a meeting for Sunday, choosing the time herself. Ms. Holland promised complete privacy, no unannounced visitors, no pressure. Meanwhile, the air inside the house grew sharper, charged with things left unsaid. Tom hovered, questions simmering behind his eyes but never spoken aloud. Karen, sensing a shift in power, grew short and irritable. She paced the halls, her conversations clipped, her smiles brittle. Once, Ruth caught her in the kitchen, rifling through the mail, eyes narrowing at a plain envelope with Ms. Holland's logo. Karen's voice, when she spoke, was all false cheer. "Anything I should know about, Ruth?" Ruth met her gaze, cool and steady. "Not unless you ask directly." On Friday, Carol brought by a casserole and a bouquet of lilacs from her yard. Ruth insisted she stay for lunch, and they talked about everything except the looming sale. Carol noticed the way Ruth's hands trembled, the flicker of doubt in her eyes, but she let her friend lead the conversation. They laughed about old recipes, the time the church choir forgot the words to "Amazing Grace," the boys who used to ride their bikes up and down Sycamore Lane. Afterward, Ruth felt lighter, her resolve stronger. She set about cleaning, polishing every surface, washing curtains, dusting shelves, even the empty spots where her heirlooms once lived. She wanted the house to be at its best, to be remembered for its comfort, not its losses. Saturday evening brought confrontation. As Ruth finished dinner, Tom approached her in the living room, voice low. I noticed you changed the locks. And you're talking to a realtor. Are you planning something? Ruth answered honestly, her words quiet but firm. I'm doing what I need to do, Tom. This is my house. Karen entered then, her face set in a mask of disbelief. You can't just make these decisions without us. Ruth's hands shook, but her spine stayed straight. I can. And I am. The argument escalated, voices rising, accusations flying, about money, gratitude, responsibility, the meaning of home. Ruth didn't waver, even as her heart hammered in her chest. When Karen shouted that she was being selfish, Ruth simply shook her head. You sold my past. You don't get to control my future. That night, Ruth locked her bedroom door, tears stinging her eyes. She reread Ms. Holland's notes, her attorney's advice, and her own journal. The words she'd written felt like armor. A home is my last word. I am not invisible. I am not powerless. The house was silent, except for the old pipes humming gently, the wind whispering through the eaves. Ruth lay awake, but not afraid. The next day she would open her doors, not to those who took without asking, but to those who would listen, respect, and maybe, just maybe, love the house the way she had. Sunday morning brought a pale sun, the kind that makes old glass sparkle and the air inside a house feel clean. Ruth woke early, nerves buzzing but her mind clear. She dressed in her favorite lavender sweater and set the kettle to boil. The house, freshly polished and filled with the scent of lilacs from Carol's bouquet, felt lighter than it had in months. Tom and Karen moved through the morning in stony silence. Tom sat hunched at the breakfast table, staring into his coffee, while Karen paced upstairs, her footsteps clipped and sharp. Ruth let them be, focusing on her own preparations. She opened the curtains in every room, letting sunlight pour over the wood floors and floral rugs. In the living room, she straightened a row of photographs. Her wedding day, her son as a toddler, her parents on their farm, and smiled at each memory. At 10, Ms. Holland arrived with a young couple, Sarah and Luis Ramirez, both teachers, with a toddler in tow. They admired the old woodwork, the spacious kitchen, the garden blooming with spring color. Ruth led them through each room, telling stories. This was my husband's favorite chair. That rosebush outside? My mother planted it after our first winter here. Sarah smiled, eyes shining. You can feel the love in this place. After the tour, Ms. Holland and the Ramirezes sat with Ruth at the kitchen table. There was laughter, talk of family recipes, questions about the neighborhood. The little boy toddled from room to room, giggling at sunbeams and chasing dust motes. Ruth felt something loosen in her chest, relief, pride, and even happiness that her home's next chapter might be written by people who truly understood its worth. After they left, Ms. Holland pulled Ruth aside. They want to make an offer, full price, no conditions. They loved the house, and they want you to know your history will be cherished. Ruth nodded, tears filling her eyes, but her heart at peace. When Tom and Karen heard, shock and disbelief painted their faces. Tom's words were stunned. You really did it. Karen's anger flared, but Ruth stood calm. I warned you, she said, voice quiet but unwavering. This house was mine to give, and I won't have my memories treated like clutter. The final days before closing were bittersweet. Carol visited often, helping Ruth pack the last of her things, sharing memories and cups of tea. Neighbors dropped by to say goodbye, leaving cards and flowers and sometimes just a long, grateful hug. On the morning of her move, Ruth walked through the empty rooms one last time. She pressed her palm to the wall where Walter had marked her son's height in pencil, traced the swirl of grain on the kitchen table, and breathed in the scent of sun-warmed wood. Thank you, she whispered, a private goodbye. She handed the keys to Ms. Holland and Sarah Ramirez in the front hallway. Sarah hugged her tightly, promising to honor every story and tradition. As Ruth walked out the door, the sun bathed her in gold, and she felt lighter, freer than she had in years. That evening, Ruth sat in Carol's kitchen, sipping tea and watching the sunset. It wasn't just a house, Ruth said softly. It was my voice. And I finally used it. Carol squeezed her hand, both women smiling at the world ahead.